I had spent years watching certain people twist the truth to make themselves look good. When I walked into that meeting room that morning, everything changed. I could feel that something big was about to happen. My name is Helena. I'm 31 years old, and by then I had learned exactly when to speak up and when to stay quiet. The room filled with praise as my sister stood proudly at the front, while everyone celebrated the contract she said would change our company. I listened silently, already knowing about the problems hidden in the papers she wouldn't explain. When the noise stopped, I stood up from my seat and asked a clear question about the numbers she had skipped over, especially the parts that didn't match any vendor record I had looked at. The change in my sister's face happened right away. Her confidence turned into anger, and her voice got louder with a tone meant to make me look bad instead of answering what I had said. She threw her arm toward the door and shouted loudly, trying to embarrass me in front of everyone. "Get her out of here." A wave of confusion moved through the room as people looked at each other nervously, unsure whether to listen to my sister or wait. I stayed right where I was, folded my hands, and let her think she was in charge. Then the door opened. Every person in the room became tense when a man walked in. His steps were steady, his face was hard to read, and even before he spoke, the feeling in the room changed as if the truth had just walked in with him. He looked toward the front and said 4 quiet words that made all the color drain from my sister's face. She went pale so fast it felt like the air had been sucked from her lungs. If you want to know why those 4 words mattered and what happened after they were said, stay with me until the end. Because nothing that came next happened by accident. In my family, nothing ever felt fair. And that truth shaped every part of my childhood in ways I only understood much later. I grew up watching expectations get placed unevenly on the people who shared my last name. My parents believed they were being fair, but their choices drew a clear line between who they celebrated and who they counted on. The company that shaped our lives had been built long before I understood what responsibility meant. It started with my grandfather, Walter, who had turned a small delivery route into a well-known shipping business in Des Moines. His stories about the early years carried lessons about working hard and sticking with things. But those lessons reached me differently than they reached Fiona. While he talked about never giving up to both of us, she got the praise while I did the work. Fiona loved the attention that came with her spot in the family, and I got used to the quieter jobs that no one else wanted. As kids, our differences showed through small but repeated patterns. Whenever we finished a task together, my parents rarely looked past Fiona's stories about what happened. She described everything as if she had done it alone, and they rarely questioned her. There were afternoons when we helped Walter organize old shipping records, and Fiona would leave halfway through only to come back when the last box was sealed. When the job was done, she eagerly ran to tell Mom that she had organized everything while I stood behind her, unsure if correcting the story even mattered. Moments like that happened so often that I stopped counting. I learned to handle disappointment quietly. It became easier to put my energy into finishing what needed to be done rather than waiting for someone to notice how much effort it took. Fiona grew comfortable taking credit that didn't belong to her, and my parents unknowingly encouraged the habit by praising her confidence without noticing what it cost me. I rarely spoke up about any of it because I found more value in the skills I was learning than in the applause she collected so easily. There were times when I tried to talk to Mom about how it felt. She listened with a kindness that made me think she understood, but her actions rarely changed. Dad repeated the same reminder each time, telling me that families worked best when everyone supported one another. The irony never escaped me, but I kept it to myself. Supporting Fiona often meant finishing my own responsibilities before stepping in to handle the ones she ignored. Yet no one noticed the imbalance. Through those years, I slowly discovered that being good at things had its own kind of power. Whenever a problem came up in the house, my parents asked for my help first because they trusted me to finish things correctly. Fiona kept taking the easier path, which allowed her to keep up the image she loved while I handled tasks that required patience and focus. Even though praise rarely came my way, I understood that I was being prepared for challenges that would eventually need more than outward charm. By the time we became adults, the gap between us had become a quiet reality. Fiona expected admiration, and I expected responsibility. What neither of us expected was how sharply those differences would clash once we both stepped into the company that carried our family name. 8 years ago, I started working at the company with a mix of hope and worry that wrapped itself around every decision I made during those early months. I knew the business carried decades of history, and I also knew I would have to earn my place without relying on anything other than my ability to learn quickly and help in ways that truly mattered. Fiona entered through a very different door, supported by the confidence that came from being familiar with people in charge and the comfort of knowing that most people expected her to succeed. I started at one of the lowest jobs in the operations department, where every mistake became a lesson I never forgot. My tasks ranged from checking shipping logs to updating digital lists, and each job forced me to understand the system from the inside out. I watched how information moved, how delays formed, and how a single overlooked detail could spread through the entire supply chain. The pace was demanding, but I found stability in understanding how the work moved, which helped me build trust with the people who relied on accuracy to keep the company running. Fiona walked into a management role confident in her ability to get attention. Her team matched her energy, which often drew admiration from coworkers who valued presentation more than process. Mom praised her during family dinners, talking about her leadership, while Dad reminded me that starting from the bottom would help me understand the company in ways Fiona never could. I held on to those words whenever frustration tried to distract me from what I wanted to achieve, because I believed the foundation I was building would matter someday. As the months passed, Fiona became known for her polished reports and convincing proposals, though many of those proposals came from conversations she overheard or ideas she took from coworkers who trusted her too easily. The first time she took credit for something I had created happened during a quarterly strategy meeting when I shared an improvement model with her the night before because she said she needed help making a few parts clearer. The next day, she presented the entire idea as if it had come from her analysis, and the praise she received changed the feeling in the room in a way that left me silent for several moments. I did not confront her because I needed to understand how far she was willing to go before deciding how to respond. I chose to let my actions speak for me. I put every spare hour into improving process maps and studying data trends that showed problems no one had noticed. Small changes began to reduce delays, which eventually caught the attention of supervisors who valued dependable results. I never tried to highlight my accomplishments because I believed they would become visible through consistency rather than through announcements. Fiona kept shining publicly while I grew quietly in the background. And even though anger tried to surface at times, I reminded myself that real progress rarely needed applause to hold value. Each year added a layer of experience I had not expected when I first walked into the building. The responsibilities grew, and I learned how to balance pressure with clarity, which made me far more prepared for leadership than I first realized. While Fiona kept the spotlight, I built the structural knowledge that kept it from collapsing. Our paths moved forward in ways that seemed side by side, but the distance between them grew with every project finished and every challenge met. By the time the company announced plans to work on a major new contract, I understood that our differences would soon crash again. Only this time, the stakes involved far more than praise or recognition. One random afternoon, while I was looking at a set of shipping reports for a department that had asked for my help with a system error, a familiar folder name appeared on the screen and caught my attention with an odd sense of worry. I had seen Fiona's documents countless times, but something about the placement of this file, hidden among unrelated requests, made me pause long enough to open it. I expected a routine proposal or an internal draft, but the moment the contract page loaded, a quiet heaviness settled across my chest, as if the numbers themselves carried a warning that demanded patience and clarity before I dared to continue. The first detail that made me read more carefully was an unusual payment schedule that forced our company to pay costs long before the partner confirmed any work. I reread the section several times, hoping I had misunderstood a complicated paragraph that looked as if it had been put together without any plan to protect us. The next section troubled me even more because it shifted blame toward our side if there were shipping delays, equipment problems, or customs issues that normally required shared responsibility. Every sentence felt written to trap the inexperienced, and I knew Fiona often rushed through contract reviews whenever praise was within reach. I tried to understand how she had missed so many warning signs, but the deeper I went, the clearer it became that these problems were not just mistakes, but structural gaps designed to hide something bigger. I moved on to double-check the partner's past records through internal databases that tracked industry performance. The first record already raised a big red flag because of a previous investigation into unusual financial movements that had never been fully resolved. I dug deeper and found a pattern that repeated across several shipping quarters in which this same group had moved funds in ways that pressured smaller companies into covering their money problems. Their tactics looked like a cycle of hidden withdrawals, followed by sudden project abandonment once dependency had been created. 2 companies documented serious losses after working with them, and one never recovered from the sudden loss of money. Each discovery tightened the knot forming in my stomach because the contract Fiona planned to sign looked exactly like the early stages of those same schemes. I collected more details to make sure I was not misreading incomplete reports, then traced the negotiation trail Fiona had documented in her digital notes. Her comments showed full confidence in the partner and suggested she believed the deal would raise her reputation across the executive team. My attempt to share a subtle warning during an internal discussion later that afternoon resulted in an immediate dismissive reaction. She accused me of being jealous before I even finished my sentence, then said that I enjoyed hurting her work whenever she stood on the edge of recognition. She did not ask what I had found, nor did she question why a routine review had upset me enough to talk to her directly. Her refusal to listen narrowed the choices available to me because I could not allow the company to be pulled into a financial trap that would take years to recover from. I went back to my desk and reread the contract once more, while the tension inside me turned into a quiet determination. The more I looked at the documents, the more certain I became that someone needed to speak before Fiona finalized the deal. She had already sent out an announcement draft that celebrated her upcoming achievement, and it was clear she planned to present the contract at the upcoming meeting with full confidence in her success. I understood that confronting her directly again would only make our conflict worse without fixing the risks buried in the agreement. The responsibility now rested on me to raise the issue in the only place where accountability could beat pride. I knew that once the meeting began, I would challenge the contract in front of the leadership team if Fiona insisted on moving forward. 1 week later, the important meeting finally arrived with an energy that made the entire company unusually alert, as if every conversation in the building was moving toward the same place. Fiona took her seat near the front, completely confident the event would end with her receiving praise that would echo through every department. Mom and Dad settled in nearby with expressions that already showed pride, as if the outcome had been decided long before the meeting even began. I walked in with steady steps because I knew the weight of what I carried and understood that this meeting would reveal more than a disagreement between 2 sisters. Fiona began the presentation with a practiced smile that showed she had rehearsed this moment many times. She talked about expected growth with a tone that suggested she alone had pulled the company toward a brighter future. Every compliment from the executives around her seemed to feed the belief that she had become a hero. Comments about her perfect leadership filled the room until her confidence grew so big that she barely glanced at the notes she had prepared. I waited and listened as she discussed the contract she believed would secure her status. Each sentence made it harder to stay silent because I knew the truth would eventually clash with everything she was saying. When the chief operating officer invited questions from the team, I stood up and felt every gaze turned toward me with a mix of curiosity and doubt. I explained that I had reviewed some numbers connected to the contract during a routine check for another department and had found problems that needed immediate attention. Fiona stiffened as if my words were an attack meant to embarrass her rather than a professional concern. I continued because the stakes were too high and I could not let her interpretation twist what I needed to share. I laid out the problems in the payment schedule and pointed out the structure of the risk clauses. Her face tightened with anger as I listed the warning signs that matched the patterns of past financial collapses tied to the partner company. Before I finished my reasoning, Fiona shot up from her chair with a glare that showed how fragile her calm truly was. She pointed at me as if I were an intruder rather than her sister. Her voice cut through the room with a rage that had been building ever since she believed she had secured her victory. She shouted with a force meant to shame me into silence and said, "Get her out of here." The executives exchanged uneasy glances because her reaction was so extreme that it shattered the polished image she had been building all morning. I stayed exactly where I stood because panic would only strengthen the story she wanted everyone to believe. I controlled my breathing while the room spun into confusion. A few managers whispered among themselves, uncertain whether they should step in or pretend they had heard nothing. Fiona kept demanding action until the tension became thick enough to make several people shrink back in discomfort. I refused to move because truth did not need dramatics. It needed presence. The conference doors opened behind us, and several heads turned toward the sound. A man stepped inside with a calmness that quieted the scattered whispers. As he walked farther into the room, his presence sharpened into someone I knew better than anyone else in the building. I recognized him as my grandfather, Walter. The moment he appeared, Fiona's face lost every bit of color because she understood the authority he carried. He looked at the table, noticed the documents in Fiona's hand, and then said the 4 words that changed everything. He said, "The contract is void." He already knew about the contract after I called him early that morning when the problems finally became too clear to ignore. I told the room that I couldn't stand by and watched the company walk into a deal that would make everyone pay for one person's rush. I knew Fiona would ignore any warning, so I turned to the only person who could look at the situation with clarity. As my words settled, the feeling in the room changed, and several people lowered their eyes as if they had just understood a truth that had been in front of them all along. The next morning arrived with a tense stillness that felt unusual for a company that rarely paused for anything. But the moment I stepped through the hallway, I sensed that the air itself carried the weight of something unchangeable. The executives gathered earlier than usual, and whispers faded the instant Walter requested a closed meeting for a review that would determine the integrity of our entire leadership structure. I took my seat quietly, aware that every gaze carried its own question about what the day might reveal. The head of internal auditing, who had always kept a calm presence in even the most stressful times, opened a thick folder that contained several months of financial activity linked to Fiona. It was the first time I heard the team put into words concerns that had apparently lingered beneath the surface, hidden by her influence and the confidence she projected so easily. The auditor spoke carefully, while presenting transactions that moved company funds toward an unregistered second account, a detail that caught the room off guard because of how carefully the transfers had been hidden. No one interrupted as the team continued with statements gathered from multiple departments, each describing moments in which employees felt pressured to follow decisions that skipped standard procedure. A younger analyst who introduced herself with a shaky voice explained how she had been told to give up full credit for her designs despite evidence showing that she had completed most of the work. The discomfort in the room grew heavy as she talked about the atmosphere of fear that surrounded any attempt to question Fiona's instructions. Another staff member described the quiet changes Fiona made to performance records without sending reports to the supervisory board. The auditor confirmed these problems with archived data that showed changes to entire parts of the system adjusted in ways that helped her position, while leaving other departments open to criticism whenever deadlines slipped. Each revelation moved the room further away from the admiration that Fiona once commanded, replacing it with a mix of disbelief and a growing realization that her charm had hidden a deeper pattern. Mom and Dad eventually stood up from their seats, trying to defend Fiona by talking about her workload and the pressure they believed she carried alone. Their voices held more desperation than belief, a tone that made the silence around them feel sharper than any accusation. Walter listened with a patience that only highlighted the seriousness of his role, and when he responded, he did so with a clarity that allowed no argument from anyone present. He stated that influence and favoritism could not stand above accountability, especially when the company's future depended on the truth. Internal auditing said that the problems required a full independent investigation, and the board reached an agreement without a single opposing vote. The decision to suspend Fiona took only a moment, but the impact settled heavily across every department represented in the room. I watched the realization appear on the faces around me that the image of excellence Fiona created for years had broken beyond repair. The meeting ended with the acknowledgement that the company would move forward only by examining every layer of the system she once controlled, making sure that nothing remained hidden as the investigation went on. 1 week after the investigation, a different quiet settled over the company, and it carried a clarity that no one could soften. What came from the final report was a picture of choices my sister Fiona had tried to hide behind influence and charm, but the evidence refused to bend in her favor. The internal team decided that she had moved company funds into a second account she never told anyone about, and the explanation she offered fell apart the longer she tried to hold on to it. The auditors presented a timeline showing how several transactions lined up with changes Fiona had made to the project files. They showed the committee where numbers were changed without permission and how design changes had been put in place without review. Every detail painted a picture of someone who believed she would never face consequences, and each revelation deepened the silence in the room. I watched the faces around the long table shift from confusion to disbelief, and then to something close to acceptance as the truth settled in. When the decision to fire Fiona was announced, the room stayed still, though the weight of it felt huge. Her actions were ruled as violations serious enough to restrict her ability to get future senior positions in the industry, and the consequences became official the moment her badge was turned off. I stayed seated as she left the building, surrounded by an uncomfortable hush that stretched across the hallway. Mom and Dad confronted me later that afternoon with a frustration that refused to accept what the investigation had proven. They said I could have supported Fiona differently and insisted I should have protected the family name by staying silent. Their disappointment carried a bitterness I recognized from earlier years, but it struck me in a place I thought had grown numb. I listened while they defended her with arguments built from emotion rather than fact, and the distance between us widened in a way I no longer tried to resist. Walter spoke to the board shortly after, and his tone left no room for doubt. He removed Fiona from all inheritance considerations and made it clear that leadership demanded accountability rather than favoritism. When he later called me to his office, I expected a brief acknowledgement, but he offered a new position shaped around the system's improvements I had built over the past years. His confidence in my work steadied something inside me that had felt shaken throughout the ordeal. Late that evening, after the official announcements were released, Fiona tried to reach me through several messages filled with a mix of regret and desperation. She asked for a chance to explain, and she insisted she had reasons I never understood. I read each line while standing by my window, and the familiar ache of old family patterns returned for a moment. I chose silence instead of responding because anything I said would only reopen wounds that needed to close. For the first time, I let the quiet speak for me, and it marked the beginning of a boundary I should have drawn years ago. 3 months later, I looked back on everything with a calm I had rarely allowed myself to feel. The chaos that once wrapped around every corner of my life had slowly dissolved, giving way to a steadier rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar. My days carried a sense of clarity that had been missing for years, and I finally understood how much strength it took to let go of burdens that were never mine to carry. The department Walter assigned to me settled into a grounded pace, and the transition revealed a quiet truth that surprised even those who had doubted me. I saw how the team grew more confident when they were given direction rooted in fairness rather than pressure. The trust they placed in my leadership pushed me to rise each day with a focus that felt deeply earned rather than inherited. And the progress we built together showed me that stability could come from the simplest decisions made with honesty. The company found its footing again once the investigation faded, and the absence of turmoil allowed every division to breathe in a way I had never seen. Fiona struggled to deal with the consequences tied to her record, and the distance between her and my parents widened with an inevitability no one could reverse. I stopped trying to figure out their silence because chasing their approval had never brought me anything except doubt. Choosing my own path felt less like rebellion and more like stepping out of a room that had been dim for far too long. I moved forward with a certainty that did not need applause, and the quiet that followed felt unexpectedly freeing. I learned that boundaries within a family are not a betrayal, but a way to preserve one's sense of self, especially when loyalty is used as a shield for harmful behavior. Standing firm in a professional environment often means accepting that truth will upset those who rely on manipulation. But honesty remains the only foundation strong enough to protect what matters. Speaking up may invite conflict, but silence always demands a greater cost. Thank you for staying with me until the final moment of this story. Your time and presence mean more than you realize, and I hope something within my journey connects with your own experiences. I would love to hear how you handle loyalty, fairness, or family expectations in your life. Feel free to share your thoughts or stories below so we can learn from one another.